Today's session is the first of our new Think Fathers webinar series. We're going to be doing these once a quarter, and we've created this series to provide you with bite-sized insights into fatherhood research, policy and practice. Today's session, as you can see, is about education, and we're focusing on boys in particular because we think that's something lots of you will be interested in, and there's a lot to say about it. So I'm here to just give you a quick introduction to our four illustrious speakers. I'm going to do that in the order in which they're going to speak, and then I'm going to leave it to them to do their presentations. They've got 10 minutes each, and then they will pass the baton on to the next person. So first off, we're going to hear from Adrienne Burgess, who is the head of research at the Fatherhood Institute. She co-founded our organisation in 1999, and since then she has really helped put fatherhood on the map as an issue of concern for policymakers, researchers and practitioners in the UK and beyond. Adrienne led our 6th report, Contemporary Fathers in the UK Evidence Review series, funded by the Nuffield Foundation, the most recent of which, The Kids Are All Right, looked at UK adolescents and their fathers and was published last year. Following Adrienne, we're going to hear from Dr. Helen Norman, who is an associate professor at Leeds University Business School. Helen has led several research projects focused on fathers' involvement in early childcare, including the Peace Study, on which we were co-investigators, and she's also collaborated on other education-related projects, including one about early years provision during the pandemic. After Helen, we're going to hear from Dr. Alex Blower, who is Access and Participation Manager at the Arts University Bournemouth. So Alex has a strong focus on how we might support students from underrepresented backgrounds to access creative subjects in higher education. And his doctoral research focused on inequality and access to university for white working class boys in the West Midlands. And in 2023, he founded the Boys Impact Network, which he's going to tell us more about briefly today. Finally, we will hear from Jeszemma Howl, who is the Fatherhood Institute's head of training. Jez is a passionate advocate of father inclusive practice. She has a background in early years education and safeguarding, and she leads our training offer, including workforce development and parenting programs, and including FRED, Fathers Reading Every Day, which is the focus of her contribution today. Once we've heard from everybody, there should be time for some questions, which you can add using the Q&A tab or type into the chat box. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Adrienne to give us her thoughts.
Hello, I'm very pleased to be here. Can you see me? I'm not sure if you can. My colleague Jeszemma, is going to do the slides because for some reason today, I cannot understand why, I can't share my own screen. Here she is, she's done that. That's very good. I'm doing the background. So this, my 10 minutes is to tell you what's actually going on in the background in terms of gender and educational entertainment. Attainment, not entertainment. Jez, we'll have quite a lot of bullet points. I've put quite a lot that will fly in one after the other. So you'll have to just judge those as I talk, and I hope that'll work. Let's go on to the next slide, please. The next slide is really about the Fatherhood Institute. I've put it up here particularly so that people who see it later will be able to thank you, Jez. We'll be able to understand what we do, but fundamentally we do research, which is the kind of thing that I'm involved in, and that gives us the basis for everything we do in policy and in practice. So our mission has really stayed the same since the beginning. Every few years we review it, and we never can find a reason to change it. So it's to give all children strong, positive relationships with their father or any father figures, supporting both mothers and fathers as workers and carers. So the gender equality stuff is really strong there. And then, of course, the future-proofing, preparing both boys and girls for roles in sharing, earning, and caring. Next slide, please. Right, so cyclical panics, I've called this slide. And Jez, that's right. Thank you for the first one. And there are 3 here. What I discovered when I looked into this, when every 20 years or so, there's this huge panic about boys' education. So nothing new. And boys have generally always lagged behind girls at various ages. So the grammar schools, as many of you will know, did restrict entry to girls because at age 11, if they'd gone on results alone of the entrance test, the girls would have outnumbered boys considerably in the grammar schools. But I was also talking to a friend who was around in the 1980s working on women's rights, and she told me that they had to work very hard at Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties as it was then, because they found that what was happening was these girls were getting into medical school, they were being kept out. They admitted more boys not on the results, so it was really discriminatory. The most recent panic has come from the Select Committee on Education just before the election was called, and they've been taking evidence on boys' attainment and education engagement in education, which they saw as a huge problem. So what did I discover when I really looked at the facts? Next slide, please, Jez. So there is a gender gap at So what is the gender gap at GCSE? So in 2024, we've got the data. 71% of female students achieved a grade 4 or higher in their English language GCSE, compared to only 64.2% of male students. Interestingly, though this is significant, it's always in reading literacy that girls particularly outperform boys. This is a narrowing of the gender gap, which was 8.8 percentage points in 2019. Now, in GCSE maths, boys typically do better than girls. There's some data there which you can read later. But girls' attainment is falling. This was really weird. And boys' grade 4 attainment in maths is improving. Next point. Now, in English language GCSE, the proportion of boys achieving a grade 4 increased from 54% in 2019 to 57.8% in 2023. So that's really quite a big summary. And what you get there is that boys overall, boys' grades are improving and girls are declining, which is a worry. We don't know why. People say maybe mental health, but we don't know. So the gender gap, interestingly, is actually narrowing. Next slide, please. Ethnicity. Now, don't put up any bullet points yet, Jez, because Attainment 8, I want to explain what that is. Attainment 8 is this summarizing of a student's performance at GCSE, which they do by they're adding these things together. They give double emphasis to maths and English, and then they say this is what the attainment of the young person is at age 16. So first bullet point, please. Now, what you get is that in every ethnicity, girls on average outperform boys in attainment at age 16 by about 5 percentage points. So it's statistically significant. And it's there it is. Next bullet point, but it differs by ethnicity. Not all boys are achieving less than girls, so if we look at it like this, in every ethnic group, the girls are slightly ahead of the boys. So the Chinese population in the UK is at the top. And Chinese boys are slightly below Chinese girls, but they outperform girls of every ethnicity apart from their own. Next bullet point, please. The second highest achieving ethnic group of boys, similarly, those are Indian. The girls in their group outperform them by a few percentage points, but they outperform girls in every ethnic category except their own, the Chinese, who are at the top of the heap, and a group called Other Asian, and they're on a par there with the other Asian girls. So it's very interesting. You've got so much differences. It's okay, Jez, you can go on. Thank you. But the big difference, and this is the whammy, is socioeconomic status. Okay, first bullet point, please. We're talking still about the Attainment 8 data. Adolescents in receipt of free school meals when they're at age scored a full 15 points in attainment lower than those not in receipt of this benefit. Remember that the difference between the boys and the girls, the gender difference, where it exists, is usually about 5 points. But 15 points is the difference in socioeconomic status. So the greatest gap in attainment is not between boys and girls, but between advantaged and disadvantaged young people of both sexes. On to the next one. Girls' advantage, and the other thing is when you look in the future, so that you've got this clear advantage, as we've seen, for girls in reading literacy at age 15 to 16, but it doesn't persist into adulthood. At both 16 to 18 years and at 55 to 65 years, there are no statistically significant gender differences in literacy scores. And finally, Jez, males, however, are performing at those ages an average of 14.3% better in numeracy than females. Next slide, please. So why do we care so much and have all these panics about boys' attainment? I mean, boys' attainment is a problem, especially in the lower socioeconomic. Of course, it's a problem classes. We've seen this, as is girls, right? But why are we bothering so much about boys? First bullet point, please. Yes, I think it's patriarchal values. They were quite clear when they stopped, patriarchal values, they were quite clear when they stopped girls going to medical school back in the 1980s. They were really kind of quite open about their worries. You know, if girls were going to earn more than boys, and, you know, which if all these girls qualified as doctors, then, you know, they'd earn more than a lot of boys. And does that mean families would fall apart? How do girls find someone, you know, better educated, able to earn more if they're the ones who are doing the earning? So patriarchal values is not talked about now, but I think it's still there. Second important point is that boys who face difficulties are more likely than girls to act out. You know, they play up, you know, the boys at the back. Remember them from my school days, and they disrupt both their own and other people's education, including behaviours that cause school exclusion. So what you've got here is boys who face difficulties with learning, with poverty, with mental health issues. They cause trouble, and so we care about that. It disrupts us a lot. Next bullet point. But the girls don't. Well, some do, of course. But more often what they do is internalize their problems. They get depressed, anxious, inattention and daydreaming is their sort of get out from where they are, so that though they're equally suffering, they don't cause trouble so obviously. Okay, next slide, please. So what works in improving school attainment in reading literacy in boys? Because not only have there been panics, there have actually been quite a few interventions which have looked at doing this. You know, more recently, someone suggested, you know, hold all the boys back at age 4, give them another year in preschool, then they'll catch up. You know, quite dramatic things have been suggested. Single-sex classes, single-sex schools, you know, all that sort of stuff has been considered. So let's see what actually works. First bullet point. So I was interested to find there was a big 4-year project starting in the year 2000 in England, that it looked at strategies in the school to improve boys' learning, motivation, and engagement with schooling. Next bullet point, what worked? Next. Best thing was quality teaching. Improve the quality of the teaching, and the boys really come up. Now, we've known this for a long time, that girls are more likely to put up with bad teaching than boys. They don't act out as much, right? So that improving the quality of the teaching improved both boys and girls, but improved boys more. The next thing that worked was individual coaching and target setting for students who were falling behind. This was a huge one. Identify the problems early and then work with these kids. This is your coaching strategy. So those were the two things. But the thing was that these initiatives were on the whole equally effective for boys and girls. So that though the boys came on considerably, so did the girls. But the gender gap did not narrow. And finally, this was I think the thing I found most interesting. They had these learning offers in these schools, right? The boys didn't sign up as much. The girls were much more enthusiastic about signing up. So the boys who really needed it were just not signing up. So it was not that they wouldn't have worked with the boys, but they weren't getting the boys' sign-ups. So what's to be done? How are we going to increase sign-ups to learning officers by boys? I don't think most people have looked at that. We have, because we think fathers, and what we found in our travels is that engaging fathers does have, as well as is likely to have, more success in engaging sons. Because when you look at most literacy programs, mothers, and family learning stuff, 90% of the parents who take part are mothers. Now, of course, a lot of these mothers will have sons, but, there's nothing here which is supporting the boys, particularly. So it's really important to think fathers, because as this first bullet point shows, almost as many fathers, that's 73%, as mothers, 77%, are reported by their children to be key reading influencers. So what the dads do matters to the children. Next bullet point, please. Of course, input by two parents is likely to be of greater value than input by only one. That's shown in a whole range of areas. The thing with the dads and the sons is that, of course, there's a thing called same gender imitation, which, of course, all children engage in from beginning. Unconsciously, mostly just absorb it like sponges. Same gender imitation is likely to increase boys' interest and enthusiasm when their fathers take part. So it shows that. And there's room for increasing fathers' input. I mean, they're not doing nearly as well as mothers. 33% of fathers, compared with only 5% of mothers, say they do not regularly read with their children aged 0 to 7. And 31% of fathers, compared with 17% of mothers, say they do not feel confident choosing books that their children would enjoy, despite the great majority wishing to support their children's reading journeys. I think we can finish there, Jez. Sorry about the coughing. And I'd pass on to the next speaker. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, I think that next speaker is me, so just bear with me while I share my slides. Thanks, Adrienne, that was really interesting, and actually chimes quite well with what I'm going to present as well now. So can everyone see my slides okay? Yeah, I've seen a nod. Okay, great. So my talk is going to be about fathers. and exploring the effects of paternal involvement on children's educational development. I've got 10 minutes and this is what I'm going to cover, and it's mainly research that has been generated from our PEACE project, which Jeremy mentioned at the start, which stands for Paternal Involvement and its Effects on Children's Education. So I'll give you some of the sort of main findings from that and reflect on some of the implications of it. So just a bit of background context to this study and how we became interested in it. So obviously we know that fathers are more involved in childcare than previous generations of fathers were, but the actual implications on their children are quite unclear. We know from previous research that parental childcare involvement is really important for supporting children's development, but most of that research is based on studies conducted with mothers or with parents in a more general sense, parents that kind of lump mothers and fathers together. And that body of work shows that when parents engage in interactive, educational types of activities with their children, it can help them to do better at school. Obviously, the Fatherhood Institute, we've got all that other little bits of research about reading, and that's really important too. But overall, in the sort of academic literature, we know less about fathers in particular and how they impact on their children's educational attainment independently of mothers. So that kind of led to our sort of overarching research question, which was actually, could it be that paternal childcare involvement has different consequences for a child's educational development? So that's where the PEACE study was born. And the aim of our study was to explore whether and how fathers' childcare involvement influenced their children's educational attainment in primary school in England. This was a funded study. The funding officially ended last year, but the work, the writing from it, the presentations, we're doing some follow-on work, it's still ongoing. You can see the project team are listed on the slide there, and as Jeremy said at the start, he was one of the co-investigators on the project. That picture there is a picture of our report, which is published on our project website, peacestudy.org, which details a lot more of the information and details about the project than what I'll present today, if you're interested. So the project included quite a lot of research questions, and I've just listed some of the kind of key questions that we were concerned with on the slide there. And the main overarching question for the project was, does paternal engagement help to increase educational attainment for children at primary school? We were also interested in whether paternal engagement supported better kind of behaviour in children as well. And then also relevant for today, we were interested in gender. So whether father's engagement is particularly important for boys or girls, or whether the gender didn't matter, because we know that there are attainment gaps according to gender. But we're also interested in whether father's involvement lessened the known negative effects of poverty, because there's obviously lots of evidence that advantaged and disadvantaged children, there's the stark attainment gaps there, as Adrienne has just described. So the main thing we did was the statistical analysis of the Millennium Cohort Study. So this is a longitudinal survey. Our sample was around 5,000 two-parent mother-father households in England. So it's a very particular family type. The way in which we measured engagement, I'm not going to go into all the stats around this, but there are further details in our report. But it basically was like a composite measure that captured how often fathers engaged in kind of interactive educational activities, and I've listed them on the slide there, things like reading, playing with toys, drawing, playing sports and outdoor games. So it kind of captures all of that. We also, as I said, were interested in children's behaviour, and that was measured as their kind of emotional hyperactivity, conduct, peer socialisation and pro-social behaviour. So what I'm going to do, I don't have time obviously to present all the stats and the models that we did. As I say, further details are in our report, but I'm just going to bullet point some of the main headlines from kind of what we found. So first of all, the key thing we found was that paternal engagement in childcare had a positive association with a child's overall educational attainment in the first year of primary school at age 5. So that's engagement in all those activities, reading, drawing, playing, and so on. So father's involvement was important. What we found about the mother's involvement or the mother's engagement, that was also important, but it seemed to bring different things to the child's development. So it affected the child in quite different ways. So the mother's engagement had a positive association with the child's emotional hyperactivity, conduct, pro-social behaviour. So this is suggesting that father's and mother's engagement is operating in quite different ways. They're bringing quite different things to a child's development. We also found that paternal engagement at age 5 was associated with a child's later attainment at age 7. So all of this is suggesting that supporting, encouraging dads to be involved from an early age is important because of the immediate and longer term effects on a child's education. So what about gender? Does gender matter? Does the father's involvement have different consequences for boys versus girls' education? Well, our data, first of all, no surprise, supports all the other evidence out there in our data. In our sample, girls were more likely to do better at school compared to boys, but we found no significant differences in the effect of father and mother involvement on children's behaviour and educational outcomes. So there was no sort of differences there. So what does this mean? Well, it just means that father's engagement is important for all children, regardless of the gender. It doesn't bring specific things for boys or girls, it's just important for all children. What came out as a more important area, and this is where this really aligns with what Adrienne was just presenting, was the influence of poverty and the stark differences in education attainment between children from more affluent households and those that were in households that experienced poverty, which was defined as having a household income below the UK median before housing costs. And we found that if a child had experienced poverty at any point during the first 3 years of their life, they were less likely to do well at school compared to their more affluent peers. So that suggests living in poverty has a detrimental effect on education attainment at school and a scarring effect on a child's education attainment if this is experienced at a very young age. What about dads and their engagement, as given that's the focus of our project? You know, can that be any help here? So we found that although father's engagement had a positive effect on a child's education attainment, regardless of poverty status, it didn't make any difference to the impact of poverty. So we can't say, you know, father's involvement is a solution to the impact of poverty. There are much more deeper underlying issues connected to being in poverty that we need to address, and we talk about some of that in our report. So to conclude, first of all, what's this project shown? Well, first of all, the headline, one of the headlines is fathers and mothers bring different inputs to a child's cognitive and educational development. And this is why supporting dads, mums of course, but dads to be involved in their children's care is important for all children, regardless of gender. Obviously, providing the dad is a loving, caring, you know, man who's, you know, it's important for him to be involved if he's around and available. So this is important for boys because more engaged fathers obviously might help them to progress at school, but it's also important for girls so that they don't fall behind either. And I don't think we should become complacent with supporting girls to do well, especially since they're more likely to face multiple disadvantages in their later education and career pathways. For example, experiencing motherhood pay penalties, which is a root cause for the gender pay gap, more likely to experience discrimination at work, more likely to be overlooked for promotion, more likely to face barriers to career progression. So it's important, I think, not to be complacent, and supporting boys and supporting girls is really important. But in terms of what I feel is really pressing to address are those stark differences in education attainment between advantaged and disadvantaged children. Because our data, other data, what Adrienne said, it all indicates that, you know, more disadvantaged children continue to fall behind their more advantaged peers. So that's something really that we do need to address. Thank you. And sorry, I should now hand over to Alex.
Thanks, Helen. Good afternoon, all. It's lovely to virtually meet you. Just bear with me 2 seconds whilst I make the appropriate screen share. Fingers crossed, you can now all see that. Helen, I can see you. Could you just give me, yeah, brilliant. Fantastic. Yeah, hi all. Yeah, just to kind of reintroduce myself quickly, I'm Dr. Alex Blower, a research fellow at Arch University, Bournemouth, and also founder of a national network called Boys Impact, that works to support the educational attainment and progression and close gaps for young men who are eligible for free school meals. Whilst the focus is fathers, as it's an event organised by the Fatherhood Institute, I think engagement with young men in education has a very, very important role to play within that, because essentially, you know, these young men are going to be fathers of the future. From personal perspective, from a working class town in the West Midlands, due to my father battling with alcohol addiction and issues with mental health. I myself missed a lot of school through suffering from acute anxiety, and through the kind of social rules of the game. When I got back into school, it wasn't too long before I was excluded from school. When I think back to my father's father, my grandfather, he died at an early age, had issues with addiction and substance misuse and mental health problems as well. And that's because when we talk about issues that might be related to masculinity, to social inequality, they're intergenerational issues. They're not young men who are operating free of all of these social conditions that operate around them. And actually that trauma can be a baton that's passed down intergenerationally unless we do something to address it. So I'm really pleased to be able to be involved and speak from Boys Impact's perspective in this event. A little bit more context about Boys Impact. We're a movement. We're dedicated to addressing the gap in educational outcomes for boys and young men who experience free school meals or receive free school meals. We're a network of educators, research and practitioners who are strengths-based and evidence-led. We exist to create ecosystems in educational research, policy and practice, which enables boys and young men who experience socio-economic inequality to flourish. And we know that this issue has been around for a very long time, and it's already been highlighted very articulately by two of our previous presenters. I noticed there was some research cited from Younger, which was one of the kind of big policy reports by academics from the University of Cambridge engaging with boys' achievement and disparities in educational outcomes. Before then and since then, there has been a range of different reports highlighting, articulating and re-articulating the issue, with very, very little movement strategically in terms of what can be done to address it. We've seen an awful lot of conversation and noise and perhaps panic, you know, in policy and media spheres that hasn't translated on the ground to anything significant happening. When we look at progression to higher education, specifically, and the young men's eligibility for free school meals. And again, it's important to highlight here that it is an issue that's born largely out of socio-economic inequality that we see. White British young men who are eligible for free school meals, 13% of them participate in higher education by the age of 19. White and Black Caribbean young men, 18%, and Black Caribbean young men, 20%. Roughly speaking, these percentages are around half of what you would expect for young men that aren't eligible for free school meals. Progression to higher education for young women who are eligible for free school meals is still significantly lower. And if we take a step back, just as the data demonstrated before shows, that if you are a young man and you are eligible for free school meals, then nationally, the statistic in terms of achieving a grade 5 or above in GCSE maths and English, so the old A to C, is roughly 23.3%. If you look at that total figure overall for young men who aren't eligible for free school meals, then it's 43%. And as you can see at the bottom there of the screen, with girls, it's only marginally higher. for young women who are eligible for free school meals. So it really is an issue that's couched in socioeconomic inequality, and that is why Boys Impact has a specific focus on working with young men who experience the sharp end of that inequality. And we know, in terms of activity to address it and the things that have been spoken about in the media, then there is an awful lot of assumption and stereotype that surrounds the group, whether that be to do with lack of aspiration, and that being a key reason for disparities in attainment, an assumption that boys don't like reading. We saw a recent survey that was conducted nationally that showed that teachers, 1 in 3 of them, thought boys being asked to read was seen as a punishment. We see narratives about absent fathers. We see young men from working class backgrounds specifically being homogenized into one blob of shared interests and dispositions, things like liking football, being more likely to be disruptive, being more likely to be aggressive, which doesn't take into account the nuance and diversity of these young men. What we also see when it comes to the actual research that's been conducted about what's going on, then it's intersectional, and it's due to a range of different things that are linked to poverty, linked to mental ill health, linked to peer pressure, linked to the formation of expectations with the young men around what's possible for them in the future, linked to teacher expectations about what they believe is possible for those young men in the future, all of which intersect and weave into the lives of these young men in education, to mean that these disparities in education attainment are entrenched and reproduced across generations. Now, when we're talking about engaging with young men in education, I think it's very important to do that from the right place, and that we, when I'm speaking about this work, quite often I get asked the question, right, Alex, well, if you're talking about engaging with young men, then what you're not doing there is engaging with young women who experience a whole host of gender-based inequalities born out of a patriarchal society. And I completely recognise and agree with that point. However, we take a very kind of particular view to the issue of kind of masculinity and gender-based inequalities that's maybe best summed up by J.J. Bowler, who wrote a book called Masculinity Redefined. And what he says is, because society is generally patriarchal, it's a kind of double-edged sword, a poisonous panacea. That is to say, the same system that puts men at an advantage in society is essentially the same system that limits them, inhibits their growth, and eventually leads to their breakdown. So what J.J. Bowler's saying there with the view on society as a double-edged sword is, on one side of gender-based inequalities, we see gender pay gaps, we see violence against women and girls, we see sexual harassment, we see massive inequalities with caring and in the workplace. But on the other side of that sword, we see men who are more disproportionately more likely to become homeless, to suffer with addiction and substance misuse, to have those disparities in educational attainment, to enter into the criminal justice system, and to die early by suicide. Now, these two things are true at once. It's not an either-or binary. Because of the patriarchal societal structures that we live in, then it's doing great harm to men and women. So with the approach that we're taking to targeting work specifically with young men, we are looking at working with young men to create the conditions where they can progress to futures, where they're fantastic fathers, where they're capable of strong, healthy relationships with their partners, children, and people that they love. And in order to do that, then we need to work with young men specifically to create those conditions, just as the Fatherhood Institute is doing with fathers. The way that we're going about this as Boys Impact is we have created a series of regional impact hubs that are mobilising a set of principles born out of Ulster University in Northern Ireland called the Taking Boys Seriously Principles, to pilot new approaches and activity, to use the existing evidence base and create a stronger evidence base for localised approaches to engagement with young men in their particular social and geographic contexts, which we know are intimately linked to their experience of the world around them and their time in education. Alongside this, we're running national pilots with large multi-academy trusts, including United Learning, the Authentic Education Trust, and creating an evidence base by which to take a more equitable approach to young men in education. I'm not going to go too much into it now because I'm aware that I've already used most of my 10 minutes, but please, if you're interested in finding out more about the hubs or potentially working regionally to promote activity in your area, please do get in touch. Nationally, we're already working with a host of different organisations, including partners like the NHS that are very interested in diversifying the gender balance of their workforce in caring professions, alongside multiple universities and educational partners. To find out more, you can visit the Boys Impact website, which is boysimpact.com, or just drop me an email. That's it from me. I hope I stuck to time effectively, and I will now hand over to Jez Howl from the Fatherhood Institute.
Thank you so much. Just fascinating. I don't know how I'm going to follow all of these. So my name is Jez and I am Head of Training and National Development at the Fatherhood Institute, and I'm going to talk to you today really briefly on a project called Fathers Reading Every Day. In the chat there was an interesting comment around how, as a society, are we engaging with fathers to inform and educate them of the benefits of their involvement to their child's education and attainment? And Fred is certainly one way that the Fatherhood Institute are attempting to do that. So I've got 10 minutes and I will really quickly try and explain what Fred is, how it works, and does it work with a particular lens on Fred and Sons, which sounds like a chain of bakers. So let's give it a go. So Fred is a reading for pleasure programme for fathers and their children, and it works from birth onwards. There is no upper age limit, and it's delivered mainly in family hubs, nurseries, early years settings, schools. It can be delivered in health visiting, early help, social care, prisons, libraries. Literally anyone working with families can deliver the Fred programme. We know that fathers' impact on their children's learning and development is significant. So there is a clear need to support their involvement at home and within education settings alongside mothers. But opportunities to engage with fathers are all too often missed. And this tends to leave them marginalised, especially in disadvantaged families where their positive input can bring the greatest benefit. Fred works from this thinking. Fred isn't about fixing dads or getting dads to do what they're not doing. It's about supporting fathers to understand their value and, in some cases, enhance their impact by doing things more regularly. It works best if we acknowledge and build on men's existing knowledge and skills and behaviours, rather than approaching them as if they're not involved at home and you want to change that. Fred is designed to acknowledge fathers' desire to contribute and to give them a way to understand and record and see the impact of the time they spend with their children on these learning activities. And the role of the Fred practitioner is to support them through this journey, engaging with them directly, being warm and encouraging and listening to them and answering their questions. And in most cases, we will be pushing at an open door when we invite a father to take part in Fred. Some fathers, of course, may be a bit more hesitant, as some mothers might be when you ask them to be involved in something new. They can seem especially unsure because they're so rarely targeted by early years and other family services. So it can often feel quite strange when this happens for the first time. Sometimes they can lack confidence or they might have limited time with their child. And as we've heard today, economic pressures can bring its own disadvantage for the father, including poor mental health and its impact on co-parenting. By focusing on the benefits to their children, we usually get dads on board. So fathers read every day for 4 to 6 weeks. The average time is 10 minutes a day, rising to 20 minutes after the first 2 weeks. Fred is different to other reading programs. They can read anything and anywhere. We include things like Land Rover magazines. You can read menus, you can read bus timetables. We don't mind as long as it's some kind of reading activity, and they can read in any language. Fathers are given a reading diary and ideas and tips and activities, and crucially, information on why this is important. Very often for fathers, this is the first time anyone has said, you know what you're doing there, that will help your child with this later on. Very often fathers are considered a bit of an afterthought in delivery. The service will maintain contact, so it has this extra benefit of the service and the father's relationship improving. I love this this quote from a child. Normally I wouldn't get the opportunity to be read to, and Daddy enjoys me listening to him while he reads fantastic books. So this child is gifting this to their daddy. He enjoys me listening to him. So does it work? So I'm going to go through 3 different evaluations. The first one was in one setting, one school, 180 children went through the Fred programme in one go. So it ranged from nursery to year 1. 86% of these children had English as an additional language, and 76% were pupil premium children. So most fathers say it helped them to read to their child every single day. Most will say their child chooses a book or something to look at or read more often. Most said they noticed their child having longer conversations and using new words or phrases. 91% said they felt more connected, and we broke that down. So knowing when they need quiet time or a cuddle, or there's more eye contact, or they just understand their child more. 87% said they speak to or sing with or laugh more with their child and feel more confident in reading books or telling stories with their child. And in this digital age, fathers and children are still reaching for the bookshelf. So Fred, children were just reading books, very often the same book over and over again. At that point, it was the Gruffalo. Was I think out of those 2,486 times, probably 2,000 was the Gruffalo. So this is from an evaluation from primary schools. So it was part of a DFE pilot. So fathers spent 70% more time reading to their children after Fred, and Fred children were 4 times more likely than their peers to make greater than expected progress in reading, numeracy and writing. Children on free school meals made the greatest progress, and high numbers of boys took part, so 60% of the children were boys. 86% of dads who started finished, which is an incredibly high retention rate for any parenting programme. And a third of dads said they now spend more and better time with their children. And an evaluation of Fred in early years settings, we were able to show data for a subsample of children reached by the programme across 300 settings. So it showed that Fred children did better than local authority and national averages measured using 4 foundation stage 2 assessments. And the gap between boys and girls closed, and on the reading measure, boys slightly outperform girls. So if we, I'll try and explain these graphs. So the light blue is boys, the dark blue is girls. The national average there is a gap on the right hand side. So under reading and literacy, the gap is 8%. The local authority average was around 4%, and Fred cohort closed the gap, and in fact boys did slightly better than the girls there. Now that's a stark difference there, and this is a one-off 4-week program. Listening and attention, again there's an 8% gap nationally. Gosh, what's that, around 10% gap in the local authority, and we got it down to around 2% gap for the Fred cohort. Managing feelings and behaviour, quite a significant gap nationally. The local authority followed that gap, and the Fred cohort, there was no gap at all, really, 1%. So these are huge shifts for the children. And making relationships, so nationally a 10% gap, local authority, same again, 10% between boys and girls. For the Fred cohort, look what happened to the boys. So there's a 1% increase for boys, so 94% against 93% for girls. So this one-off 4-week program can have significant impacts on fathers' reading behaviours at home, father and setting relationships, and father and child relationships. And we really hope that what Fred can do is in the future maintain this. I'll leave you with just some lovely quotes from Dad. So I've underlined some of the things that I found really touching. So I feel more confident, and Fred has encouraged me to read with a child. It's helped me and awoken me. So it's awoken. I would definitely encourage more fathers to take part in Fred. I can't read very well, and I don't normally look at books, but looking at the books for my children has definitely helped me, and I feel more confident. And again, confidence. The Fred reading gave me confidence. The information I was given regarding reading to my children and how important it is has given me courage and a closer bond. Thanks to funding from Mercer's under its Young People in Education strand, the Fatherhood Institute are currently running a 4-year evaluated programme of supported Fred delivery in 24 early years settings in Lambeth. And we are delighted to be able to do that. But we would like to bring it to every early years setting, every school in the country. I believe in Fred so much, we've held the cost of the training for the last 5 years to help local services bring Fred to their families. If you would like to know more, do search for Fred, Fathers Reading Every Day, under our services on the Institute website. You can QR code me there and it will take you straight to the parenting programmes brochure. But for now, thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Jez, and thanks to all the other speakers. It's been a fascinating and wide-ranging session, and I hope you've found it inspiring. Probably predictably, we've run over a little bit, so we've only got 5 minutes left for some questions, and a few of you have been putting some things in chat. A couple of those we will come back to you with answers. We're not going to have time to go through things now. I've just picked out one sort of question that came up a couple of times in chat, which was, is it true that involved fathers can offset some of the disadvantages of poverty. I feel like all of you might have stuff to say about that, so I'm just going to open that to any of you who wants to chip in.
I feel like Helen might have something very specific to say about that, so I'll.
Well, I mean, I can. Thanks for the question. I mean, I can refer to my analysis. So my analysis suggested it doesn't solve the problems of poverty, but fathers' engagement with their children can help children, can possibly help them to do better at school regardless of poverty status. So yes, it can help children living in poverty. Fathers can do more of these interactional educational activities with children. It can certainly help children's progression, but it's not the answer to addressing all the other issues that come with poverty, which is far more deeply rooted and difficult to address. So it can certainly help children, but it's not the solution to poverty and disadvantage.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen. A couple of questions directly related to Fred, so I'm chucking these at you, Jez. Somebody asked about children where English is a second language. Could you just tell us quickly about that? And also, can Fred be adapted to kind of work alongside other reading initiatives?
Right, I'll do the second one first. Yes, it can. Fred as a standalone programme is the one that the evaluations I showed today, but we have seen it work alongside others. There's no reason to say that it would interfere. I think actually my theory would be it would work particularly well. But the thing about Fred is it specifically targets fathers, whereas other reading programmes tend not to. So Fred sees fathers in great numbers, whereas others tend not to. The first one around children with English as an additional language, the first data I showed you, the vast majority of children had English as an additional language, and many of them were newly arrived children. So absolutely can. What we need to be promoting is that we're not teaching English through a reading programme, we're promoting father involvement and interest in their child's education, and in whatever way that is, in whatever language that is, will work. And that's the key thing, is that fathers are encouraged in the value of their role in whatever language that is.
Brilliant. I've just seen another very quick one about Fred. Have you considered incorporating grandfathers?
Okay,
have we done
so
grandfathers?
We've had grandfathers. We've had right. So we have a definition in Fred that it can be biological and non-biological fathers, and anyone the child considers is like a father to me, and that makes it wide. So the child can choose. And if the father has a biological father and a stepdad, and both do Fred, lucky child, I think. We need as many men around the children interested in their attainment as possible.
And if there really aren't any men around, then a mum will do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, so I can see that the chat is continuing, and there have been some really good questions, and I can see Helen has been answering some of them as well. I'm going to let everybody go off and have lunch now, but do stay in touch with us, and look out for the next one of these, which will be in about 3 months' time, probably on a totally different subject, but obviously with fatherhood at the centre. And if you want to make sure you stay in touch, then if you go to our website, which is fatherhoodinstitute.org, scroll down to the bottom, you will be able to sign up to our newsletter, and look at that. There's a QR code has magically appeared, which will take you somewhere fascinating, I'm sure. So thanks very much for your time, and thanks to all our speakers. who I think have done a brilliant job at sticking to time. So.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.